It may seem odd that a story about an Australia trip starts with this picture in Chicago from New Year's Day 1991, but the trip was actually initiated with this photo, published in the March 1991 issue of Pacific Rail News. Years later, mail arrives from the magazine containing a letter sent to them from Australia. That's how we communicated in the old days. The letter, from Cameron Milne, requested a poster-sized print of the image. He requested a phone call. He told me he worked for the railway and he made the mistake of offering to show me around if I was ever in Melbourne. It was just a few weeks later that I was on a flight to Australia with the poster print. Cameron was a signalman at the Brooklyn signal box. He was working when I landed, so I headed straight there. No time for jet lag or to get used to driving on the left or having the toilet water swirl the other way. I get to know Cameron and the Brooklyn signal box for the next few hours. It's slow on Saturdays. Cameron says only 4 trains on his shift. We get one while I'm there. This is a Victorian Railways Class T, which is an EMD G8 built in Australia by Clyde Engineering. It's owned by Great Northern Rail Services, a leasing company. It's not an accident that it wears Gulfmobile and Ohio-inspired paint. When Cameron gets relieved, we head over to the next signal box on the line, Newport. It's busier here, being on the Melbourne Electric Suburban line. I'm also starting to think that everyone here plays with trains, and they really like U.S. railroads, perhaps with a little artistic license. The subject of steam comes up, and the guys tell me there's one running that very weekend. The next morning it was north, 200 miles to Swan Hill. The train was running a short round trip in the morning, and then to Melbourne in the afternoon. I made a quick stop in Bendigo to see the famous talking tram, but didn't stick around long enough to see what it had to say. I had to catch up with the train. And then a brief stop to check out some parrots. Though Australia is famous for having deadly critters, I was learning that many are suicidal. Birds in the road are not as quick to get out of your way as I was used to. I successfully caught up to her before she got to Swan Hill. There, Victorian Railway Rail Tractor 14, built 1959, basically an agricultural tractor on a 4-wheel frame, switched a coal hopper on the rear of the consist. After a picture of Swan Hill's #1 attraction, a giant Murray cod that began life as a movie prop, I chased her south. This is Victorian Railway 464 Hudson Class R 707. She was built in 1951 by North British Locomotive Works in Scotland. She was in regular service until 1965, then stayed in excursion service until 1974 when she was placed in storage. She was restored and returned to excursion service in 1984. The next day we go downtown to Melbourne's main station, Flinders Street. We take a short tram ride and then head into the station upstairs to the dispatching center. Though many lines are CTC, there are still sections that are dispatched the old-fashioned way using graphs to map out the estimated location of trains over time. The main reason for our upstairs visit was this. We're going for a ride to Bendigo. Our ride will be a suburban train powered by Class N470. This is an EMD JT22 HC-2 built in 1987 here by Clyde. It's basically an SD39-2 with 2 heads. Cameron's friend is our driver. Yup, it's driver here. A discussion of the difference in railroad terms dominate the conversation for a while. A conductor is a guard, and a caboose is a guard's van. A siding is a loop around the main line. The most confusing for me is train direction being specified as being on the up or on the down. On the up refers to trains heading toward the railway's main terminal, and on the down, of course, the opposite. At Bendigo, our power leaves the passenger equipment behind and picks up a goods train to take back to Melbourne. On the way back, I learned their derogatory words for railroad is wrong here too, railway enthusiasts like gunzels, roundheads, and train winkers. Tram fans get their own term, Zoob. We top the night off with a visit to the South Dine & Shops in Melbourne. The highlight is a preserved 1953 Class B, an EMD based on the F unit, but with C trucks to accommodate axle loading, and it has 2 cabs. The vintage paint scheme is based on that of the Erie Railroad. For Cameron, Tuesday is Take a Train Winker to Work Day. I join him for an afternoon shift at the Brooklyn signal box. As you'd expect, the signal box is no longer in service, but it was still there in this 2017 Street View. First, a word on track gauge in Australia. Lots have been written about the convoluted manner they built railroads in the old days, and it goes beyond the scope of my travelog, so we'll leave it that there are basically 3 track gauges. They've been trying to sort it out for years. Brooklyn controls a 4-way junction with both standard and Irish broad gauge. Cameron hand drew this map to illustrate it for me. The red is standard gauge and the blue broad gauge. The signal box is located west of Melbourne between the signal boxes at Tottenham and Newport. Authority to proceed here is regulated by the electric train staff system. The train must be in possession of a staff marked with the 2 signal boxes that the staff is valid between. The signalman meets each train and passes the new staff up and receives the staff from the previous section. Between trains, Cameron explains the system to me, and I took notes. The staffs are handled by electric staff machines. They are electrically interlocked with the machine at the next signal box. Only one staff can be released from either machine at any time. Here is how it works for a train on the down traveling from Tottenham to Newport. Tottenham rings Brooklyn with 1 bell. The electric generated for the bell is with a hand crank. Brooklyn will now respond with 1 bell to indicate that they are present. Tottenham then gives a series of bells that varies depending on the type of train. Brooklyn repeats the signal and on the last bell holds down a lever that releases the staff the train will need to proceed from Brooklyn to Newport. When the train has departed Tottenham, Tottenham will give Brooklyn 2 bells. Brooklyn acknowledges with 2 bells and then rings Newport with 1 bell. They acknowledge. Brooklyn then sends a series of bells indicating train type. Newport acknowledges and then releases a staff for the train's downward continuation. Once the train has cleared Brooklyn and the staffs had been exchanged, Brooklyn inserts the returned staff in the machine and gives Tottenham 3 bells, letting them know that the section is clear. The last train we see is at 9:45. Then Cameron gets relieved and the shift is over. Always intrigued by wildlife, I was determined to see the fairy penguin parade before leaving Victoria. The event happens at sunset, so I'm there the next evening, but no one else is. I find someone to ask if something's wrong. No worries, they'll be here shortly, and he was right. Soon multiple tour buses pull up and tour guides herd crowds into the grandstands on the beach. The crowd is told to shut up and no flash photography. As soon as the sun sets, groups of terribly frightened penguins start showing up on the beach amid camera flashes and yakking, while ushers tell everyone to be quiet and stop with the flashes. The penguins make their dash under the bleacher to their burrows up on the beach. I felt really bad for them. The following day, Thursday, November 16th, 1995, I say goodbye to Melbourne, Victoria, and catch a flight to Brisbane, Queensland. I rented a car for a one-way trip to Cairns at the north end of the state. The big deal in Queensland is the Great Barrier Reef, the world's largest coral reef system. Off the plane and straight to Maryborough, where I stopped and by chance caught the Queensland Rail Olympic Journey exhibit train on display. Then on to Bundaberg to take a tour of the famous, apparently, Bundaberg rum distillery. I've always liked rum, but discovered during the tasting, not this one. I did, however, appreciate their 2-foot gauge sugarcane railway. Afterward, caught the electric Spirit of Capricorn, which makes a daily 400-mile trip between Brisbane and the end of wire at Rockhampton, and an electric goods train following behind. I continued north that day and into the next, catching a ballast train at St. Lawrence Creek. Found this guy along the creek. Everything in Australia can kill you. I wonder how this guy does it. Government-run Queensland Rail was the first mainline railway to adopt 3-foot 6-inch narrow gauge. They have over 4,000 miles of track in their network. Queensland also has a 2,500-mile network of sugarcane tramways crisscrossing the coastal area. These are owned by the sugar mills and are necessary because the sugarcane needs to be quickly transported to the mill. I stumbled on one operation at Kamala. As I was sniffing around, I discovered one train had a derailed car that was bouncing off the ties and kicking up a big mess. I drove to the head end and flagged it down. The driver stopped and came out and asked me why. I told him about the derailed car. He got really annoyed, waved me off, and went back to driving his train. I guess I wasn't going to be your hero today. Back on the highway, I find Hitachi Electrics on a coal train, a whole herd of EMD Clyde GL22C-2s, and a northbound goods train with an EMD Clyde GL26C. The Whitsunday Islands is a popular resort area and a starting point to get to the Great Barrier Reef. I found a cheap hostel on Hook Island and booked a trip on a small boat to the reef, which canceled. The alternative was a humongous catamaran that made a stop to pick me up. I watched a video on the way out that described the difference between white-tip and black-tip reef sharks. One's dangerous and one isn't. Later, while snorkeling, I came across a reef shark. I froze in the water trying to remember which was which. Luckily, it just swam away. Back on the mainland, I'm heading to see if I can catch a glimpse of the elusive and oddly poisonous duck-billed platypus at a national park. I didn't have much luck on my hike into the rainforest, but I saw a few kangaroos. Afterwards, I started working my way north again. That evening, I found a small family-run motel with a restaurant. Had a nice meal and chatted with the owners until closing time. Went back to my room, watched TV for a while, then went to take my shoes off. I discovered my right sock was soaked in blood and my foot was bleeding profusely from several puncture wounds in my toe. I had no idea what had got me or why I'd still be bleeding. I limped out the door and hobbled to the office to find that they had locked up and left. I went back to the room and attempted to use the phone but could not figure out how to get an outside line. Finally, a thought drifted into my head. Whatever got me, it had to be many hours ago, and I felt fine now. If I'd been poisoned, I'd probably feel it by now. I went to bed figuring I'd probably wake up in the morning. The next morning, I did wake up, and I started a load of laundry. While in the laundry room, the proprietor had gone into my room to start cleaning up. "I see you had some trouble last night," she said to me. "Oh yeah, I'd forgotten all about it. What would have got me in the park that wouldn't stop bleeding?" "Haven't you ever heard of leeches?" she said. Heading north again, it's raining. Rain brings the huge cane toads out onto the road where they like to mate in puddles. They were introduced here in the 30s to eat a pesky grub that feeds on sugarcane root. They ended up being disastrously invasive, spreading in great numbers throughout northeast Australia. Sad part is they found easier things to eat and ignore the grub. Now the suicidal toads are covering the road, impossible to miss and making cringeworthy, automatic weapon-like thuds as they strike the floorboards of the car. After following and joining a river rafting trip I saw turn off the highway, it's time to find trains again after neglecting them for a week. I shoot the once-a-week, all-first-class Queenslander with auto carriers near Ingham. The following day, the chase is on. I decided to follow the tri-weekly Sunlander on the daylight portion of its run through North Queensland. The leader is an EMD GL22C-2 built by Clyde Engineering Australia in 1982. In trail, a late 60s EMD G22, also built in Australia. The train winds its way through sugarcane fields among the Ballendencar mountain range. There are many places where the sugarcane tramways cross the main line. These crossings are manually controlled by the cane train crew. When the Sunlander arrives in Cairns, I head straight for a hostel and start planning the next day's adventure. The heavily hyped Coranda Scenic Railway and Cableway. It's a high-pressure sale all over town with agents trying to sell tour packages. Everyone threatening sold-out trains. Better get your ticket right now from us. I found it to be much cheaper to just show up in the morning and buy a ticket at the depot for a nearly empty train. I do the trip in a circle, leaving my car at Freshwater, train to Coranda, cableway to a bus for a short ride back to Freshwater. The trip takes only a couple of hours. I get back to the car and then shoot boat trains as they make their way back to Cairns that afternoon. The coaches, carriages, date back to the 19-teens, some of them serving here since tourist trains started in 1936. The locomotives are EMD GL-18Cs built in the late 60s by Clyde Engineering at Eagle Farm, a suburb of Brisbane. Next north to check out the Cape York Peninsula, where there are no trains, except maybe this one? I ended up in Port Douglas and decided to have another go at the Great Barrier Reef. I didn't take notes on this part of the trip, so when I came across these slides I wasn't sure what I was looking at, so I did an internet search on the name of the boat, Outer Edge. What I got was many references to the 2003 movie Open Water, a film about a couple that disappeared after being left behind on a diving expedition in 1997. Holy crap! This was the boat. I went out on that boat. The next day I flew to Darwin. Absolutely the hottest, humidest place I've ever been. I wanted very badly to spend some time in the famous Kakadu National Park. I drove in, visited some petroglyphs, then drove over to a recommended trailhead. I was anticipating a great hike, got a few hundred feet from the car and said, no way, got right back into the car and cranked the AC. I went on a boat trip instead. Went to an outdoor music festival where even at midnight was still unbearably hot. Had a few in a bar where I gave a woman a hard time about her lack of sense of humor. Well, okay, many people don't get mine. The next day, I went to the airport to stand by on a flight to Perth. Guess who was the airline agent? Good thing she did have a sense of humor. I rented a car and headed east into the wheat belt and gold fields of Western Australia to look for trains. I intended to get to Kalgoorlie. As I followed the main line, I ran into a train going the other way, so I turned around and chased it back west for a few hours. Australian National operates the standard gauge interstate trains. The leader is an EMD JT46C and the trail a GE C30-8. I chased to Meriden, where a friendly guy in the yard gave me intel that 2 narrow gauge trains were coming into town on 2 separate branch lines. I set out to find the first train, chasing it back when I found it. This is an EMD G22CU built 1970. 1535 is now in a museum. Then I set out after the other one, powered by another G22CU, number 1536. This is Australia's incarnation of the Budd RDC, Westrail's WCA-class railcars built in 1971 under license by Commonwealth Engineering. They run as the Prospector between Perth and Kalgoorlie, once or twice a day depending on the day. Working my way back to Perth, I spent some time near Todye, where the main line is double-tracked and dual-gauge. It gains height to cross the Darling mountain range on a series of horseshoes. The leader here is an EMD AT42C trailed by a JT46C. The next 2 trains have the Australians' lighter, shorter version of the SD40. They are EMD GT26Cs built by Clyde in 1968. Another pass by the Prospector, and I head back to Perth. It's now December 1st and I'm at the train station in East Perth for the finale of the trip, a ride across Australia on the famous Indian Pacific. The Transcontinental Train did not exist before 1970 when the trip across was made possible by the completion of a standard gauge route from coast to coast. The train is a classic streamliner with Budd stainless steel carriages built late 60s, early 70s by Commonwealth Engineering. The train is divided between 3 classes: First, Holiday, and the sit-ups. First class was very plush with decked-out diner and lounge. The sleepers had wood-paneled walls. The roulette carriage had a serpentine aisle that creates larger rooms. I quickly realized though first class was nice, I had more fun and better food in Holiday class. Strangely, they bragged their first class food is catered by Qantas. Airplane food? Really? Well, it's a foreign country. Perhaps their airplane food is of a different standard. Nope, it sucked. The holiday class diner had buffet-style food that was actually very good. There were also more people my age. I never did get a look at the coaches. Holiday class and the coaches were separated by an always locked door. Apparently, the riffraff gave them problems. On the second day, the train crosses the Nullarbor Plain over the longest stretch of continuously straight track in the world. It's nearly 300 miles without a curve. As you'd expect, there isn't much to look at. We stopped for a while at the small remote town of Cook to refuel and meet the opposing Indian Pacific and a goods train. The train is powered by one and later two Australian National CLP class EMD AT26HC-2Ms built by Clyde in 1970 and rebuilt by Morse Knudsen in 1992. They were the last locomotives to be built with the iconic bulldog nose. On the morning of the fourth day, December 4th, 1995, the train arrives in Sydney. Perfect, relaxing finish to a 3-week journey down under. My vacation time depleted, I head straight for the airport for a flight home.